because it's very important during these times now that we truly understand what we can and cannot do as organizations that are not for profit, because there's been a lot of threats of snatching the status away based on technicalities or things that are said or done. So he's going to come and share with us what to do and what not to do. So let us receive Mark Brewer.
Thank you. Well, it's great to ever see everybody. I can tell I'm in church. Everybody's at the back. I do have a handout that I'm going to work my way through. So, and there's plenty of copies there. So help yourself. Great. So let me make a couple of opening remarks, and then I want to work my way through this outline for all of you, which is a great resource and takeaway for you to use, not just this year, but on an ongoing basis for your organization. I do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations, both 501c3s and C4s, and it is a somewhat dangerous time for them, given the threats we've heard out of Washington. And so now more than ever, it's very important that people be conscious of the restrictions on the activities by those two types of groups. In general, 501c3s, which are charitable and educational organizations, such as churches and others, cannot ever, 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 ever be involved in candidate elections, taking sides one way or the other. They can do things like candidate forums conducted in a neutral fashion, and probably the most well-known, but there are many that do this, are the candidate forums held by groups like the League of Women Voters, the NAACP. Many groups do these forums, but they invite everybody, and they treat everybody equally. They don't play favorites. You can do nonpartisan voter registration and get out the vote, where you register people regardless of their politics. You urge people to vote regardless of their politics or which candidate they may favor. So those kinds of nonpartisan activities in which you don't favor a candidate are perfectly permissible for a C3. But again, no advocacy, no favoritism of any kind for or against a candidate. Even an implied kind of support is strictly forbidden. And the penalty is loss of your tax status, which can be very devastating. You could lose your tax exemption. Donors can't give you tax-deductible money, and you may, in fact, have to pay taxes on previous income. So very severe penalties for going down that path. In contrast to that, 501c3s can participate in ballot questions. It's a question I frequently get. People, I think, tend to assume because they cannot do candidate work, that means they can't do ballot question work, and that is not true. 501c3s can participate in ballot questions. They can take positions on them. They can advocate for or against them. It is considered a lobbying expense, subject to the restrictions on how much a 501c3 can spend on lobbying. So if you're a representative or active in a C3 and you want to get involved in a ballot question, feel free to do so. You'll have to comply with state law in terms of registering a ballot question committee and reporting income and expenses. But that's something everybody does, and it's a typical procedure for a ballot question. So there's some kind of general principles that I want to talk on. And then I'd like to spend some time going through this outline and then leave plenty of time for questions. I don't want to get into, I guess, specific organizational issues. We don't want to talk about your confidences in a big group like this. But I'm glad to take questions about general situations and some of the applications that we've talked about. Are we still running at about an hour in terms of time? Okay. So I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions. I think you'll get more out of that. This document, as you can see at the top, was prepared by a firm called Trister Ross. They are a superb, progressive law firm. They operate out of Washington, D.C. Some of the lawyers there are good friends of mine. I've worked with them on many, many projects, and they have just wrote and distributed this year, particularly in light of the threats we're seeing out of Washington. And I've been sharing it with all my nonprofit clients, and again, urging them to use it as a checklist, not just this year, but on an ongoing basis to make sure that you are in compliance with the law. So I just want to work through it. I'm not going to read every line, but I want to summarize the parts of it. And then if you have any questions, again, when I get done, which won't take long, we can come back and revisit any portion of this. So in terms of investigations, which might be coming our way, it's very important that you protect your organization by always communicating professionally and that you enforce this. Your emails inside your organization are something that could be subpoenaed. They could be requested by law enforcement. So anything that is unprofessional, appears to be discriminatory, or anything else like that could be used against you. And this always happens in a look-back situation, right? In the heat of the moment, somebody might have said something that they later regretted, but now it's in writing, and it's in a permanent form, and can be looked at after the fact as proof of something bad. So it's really, really important that people communicate professionally, not just by email, but in any type of communication of which there's a record. You need to have a document retention policy, and there are models out there in terms of what documents need to be kept for how long. Your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, your minutes, financial records. There are regulations and model policies available to govern that, but you should have and use a document retention policy. Now, when an investigation starts and you're notified of one, at that point you have an obligation to preserve all your documents, all your communications, and not destroy anything further, even though your document policy may allow you to do so. And we do this a lot. I'm a lawyer. We have what's called a document hold, that when my client is sued, I advise the client, no more destruction of documents. Everything's on hold until we get the lawsuit resolved. And just generally follow the relevant laws and rules of whatever the investigative body is. So that's some general rules for investigation. Now, in terms of IRS audits and compliance, in my experience, IRS audits are relatively rare, but that could change given the current climate that we're in. So you always want to be prepared for any kind of audit or question from the IRS. So that means your board needs to keep minutes. You need to keep adequate corporate and financial documents. You need to respect the separation of entities. Too often people blend a C3 and C4 together. They are separate entities. They have separate legal rules. There are many more restrictions on a C3 than on a C4. Many organizations maintain both, and that's fine. A lot of times there's overlap of board members and so forth. But again, they are separate legal entities. They need their own board. They need to make their own decisions. And you need to maintain that separation. Particularly harmful for a C3 if the IRS sees that it is blending, mixing its conduct and its activities with a C4, because a C4 C3 cannot. You need to make sure that, again, the organizations have separate strategic plans, make sure your record keeping's in order, and regularly train your staff. There are state and federal lobbying laws. There are state and federal election laws, obviously, how to keep proper time records and records necessary to file your 990s, which are your tax returns. And hopefully you'll be working with somebody who on your staff and or an accountant who will assist you with that. Another issue to be very sensitive of in this climate, but always, not just in this climate, is your relationship with foreign nationals. By this I mean not only people who are not U.S. citizens, but also people who may have a green card or they may be here on some kind of work status that allows them to be here. In general, I would avoid contracts with foreign entities for work within the United States. And in your grant agreements, and this is item 3C, there's 4 items here that you would want to make sure are contained in every one of your grant agreements. I'm not going to read them all, but those are really important, again, in case the IRS or somebody else comes looking and wants to find out, what, if any, relationship you have with foreign entities. And then in D, you want to make sure that you can always document through minutes or other documents that you are making decisions, you're making your policies, you're taking lobbying positions, for example, that are demonstrably independent of any foreign influence. It's very, very important in terms of protecting yourself in this area. Now, in addition to the IRS rules and these federal rules about foreign nationals, there are also state and local laws that govern nonprofits. Almost every nonprofit is incorporated. That's a state law process. You file your articles of incorporation with the state. They get approved. And then in Michigan, there are 2 further steps you have to take for your corporation. One is that you have to file an annual report, very brief, it's usually about a page. It's due every year. If it's not filed, the state will dissolve your nonprofit corporation, which creates all kinds of legal problems. And then for 501c3s, you are required to register with the Attorney General as a charitable organization. They'll ask a lot of questions about what's your mission, where are you raising your money. The origin of those laws is, unfortunately, we've seen too many scams over the years, right? Somebody claiming they're a charity when in fact they're just scamming money for themselves or for somebody else. And so in each state, generally it's the Attorney General regulates charities, and the way they do that is by requiring these forms to be filed on an annual basis so they can monitor and make sure people are following their charitable purposes. Now, in addition to that, and I touched on this a little earlier, if you engage in political work, for C3, again, you would not be doing candidate work, but if you have a ballot question you want to get involved in, there are Michigan campaign finance laws which require you to set up a ballot question committee and report your income and expenditures. So you'd want to make sure that you comply with that. In all of this, in this area, it's particularly important that whatever reports are due are filed on time and as completely as possible. In my experience, particularly in campaign finance, late reports, incomplete reports generate significant penalties, financial penalties. And so it's really important. I often say the most important person on a campaign, and I do a lot of campaign work, is to make sure you have a compulsive treasurer who is going to follow the rules and the regulations. They may become a pain in your neck because they're going to nag you and say, I've got to get this report in, I need this information. And it's important that they be backed up and they be supported to make sure that they're able to file all the reports on time, not only to avoid penalties, but also the bad publicity. You don't get anywhere. Matter of fact, it may hurt your mission, right? If there's a press report about a complaint was filed against your organization because you broke the campaign finance laws or you didn't get your corporate report in on time, none of us need that bad publicity. publicity. So a good treasurer, a good financial person to make sure that all these rules are followed is really important. Now at the top of page 2, and again, this is another area where training is really important. For many of my organizations that I represent, we do an annual or at least a biannual training, right? I mean, I have organizations where there's a C3, there's a C4, they may have a PAC, they may have a super PAC. And so we sit with all the staff and we go through and explain what each organization is, what it does, what are the rules governing it, and how they can work and operate. And in these sessions, I tell people there's never a dumb question. I've been doing this for over 40 years. My job is to help and explain and answer questions. You all have a lot of wonderful things that you do in your organizations. It's not your job to be a lawyer. But that's why lawyers like me can be helpful in terms of answering those kind of questions, hopefully in plain English. I think that's a real important aspect of being a lawyer, to explain things to your client clearly. But coming back to this regular training, I may have just turned this off. I think you can still hear me. Regular training is very important. We have staff turnover. Memories fade, right? Elections only come every couple of years. And so it's just really important on an annual basis, I think, to have a good comprehensive training for your staff. A couple more issues, and then we'll open it up to questions. So a whole nother area that you've got to be concerned about are employee and volunteer issues. Be sure that what's called the I-9 process is up to date and followed. This is a document that's filed with the federal government about the citizenship status of all of your workers. And evading it, trying to ignore it, is not going to be helpful, because employers as well as employees can get in trouble for failure to complete and file these documents for every employee. You need to make sure that people are eligible for employment with you, that if they are a foreign national, they've got the appropriate work visa or whatever it may be that authorizes them to work in this country, again, because neither you nor that employee want to deal with the consequences of not having that. Another area that causes trouble is the distinction between an employee and an independent contractor. For employees, you have all the obligations that an employer has, right? You have to do withholding taxes. You have to provide unemployment and workers' comp insurance for them. Sadly, and I've been a union labor lawyer in this state since the 80s, many employers try to evade those responsibilities and the costs by mislabeling people who are really employees as what we call independent contractors. These are people that usually perform projects, distinct projects for an organization. They can work for other organizations on projects. They're not directly supervised day to day. They have a wide latitude. They often provide their own work tools. They probably don't work in your workplace. But again, unfortunately, many employers abuse that independent contractor status by mislabeling their employees as independent contractors to dodge the taxes. Well, if you're caught, that can have very severe consequences. And frankly, it's mistreatment of those employees that you have misclassified, because they're being denied benefits that the law entitles them to. So be very careful in this area as to whether you're treating people as an employee or as an independent contractor. Make sure, again, this is a particular problem, item E here. If you're making payments to volunteers or interns, be sure that doesn't turn them into employees. You can reimburse people for expenses. That doesn't automatically turn them into an employee. But again, you've got to look at the rules. Who's an employee? What are proper expenses paid to non-employees, and what are independent contractors? And it pays to periodically review your policies in that regard. Finally, as to governance and liability, it's always important to periodically review your bylaws and your policies. Keep your board and officer positions filled. I can tell you how many organizations have come to me over the years and said, well, Mark, we have no board members. because somebody resigned, somebody left, somebody's not showing up, vacancies didn't get filled, and all of a sudden they're in a situation where there's an entity that has no board. So what do, right? Or they don't have officers that are undertaking their responsibilities. So make sure vacancies are filled and that your organization is kept up to date in that regard. Review your insurance. It's critically important that you have insurance against directors and employees who may steal or perform their duties in a really negligent fashion that could create harm to the organization. You can buy insurance to protect against that. Obviously, you should be vigilant in terms of what those employees and directors are doing, but you can also buy insurance to protect yourself. Have an emergency plan. I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about this. This item says, ensure the security of physical space and staff and electronic information. It's really important now. We have seen so much violence, random violence, that you make sure you have a plan for the security of you and your staff at your offices, and make sure that all the employees are aware of the plan, what they're to do in the case of any kind of emergency. Related to this, we've seen increasingly groups that hire people to infiltrate your organization. This has happened to a couple of organizations in this state. They come in and say, oh, I'd love to be an intern for your organization or volunteer. And in fact, they're basically there to spy. So you need to make sure, and it's wonderful that people are, that say that, and they may be well motivated, but make sure that you vet people, that you get a little bit of background information on them. I hate to quote him, but Ronald Reagan said this, and he was right in this regard: trust but verify. Trust but verify. Require people to provide a little bit of information about themselves, some references, something that you can check out, so you don't have these infiltrators, these people who are going to steal information, misuse it, perhaps put it online, and make the organization look bad. This has happened to Planned Parenthood around the country, and it's happened to some labor unions in this state. So it pays to be safe in this regard. This plan should also include, at this point, a contingency plan. Suppose your major funder is a government organization, and because of budget cuts, either at the state or federal level, the funds disappear. I know we don't want to think about this, but what does your organization do? Including up to dissolving and the organization going out of existence. What's the plan? How are you going to take care of your liabilities? How are you going to treat your employees? You need to plan for the worst case scenario, because the only thing worse than the worst case scenario is hitting a worst case scenario and not having a plan and having to do it on the fly, right? And you're making decisions about people's livelihoods and about the organization's future, but you're winging it. And you're doing the best you can, but you are winging it. And that's not a good way to go. So make a plan for the worst case scenario and review it every year. It's like an insurance policy. We hope we never have to use it. It's like the fire department. We hope we never have to call it. But be prepared for that and think through in advance how you would deal with that. There may be circumstances in which maybe all your funding doesn't disappear. But what if half of it disappears? What are you going to do? Do you have a plan to raise other money? Are you just going to cut your budget in half immediately? So I know, again, it's painful, difficult to contemplate, but believe me, it's a lot less painful than going through it without a plan. So I really urge you, make a plan for the kind of situation that you may confront. Even if all the chaos we're seeing at the federal level goes away, this thing can happen even in normal circumstances. Civil disobedience. I'm a great believer in civil disobedience. I love Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi and what they stood for and what they taught us. Unfortunately, too many of us have forgotten what they taught us and how to do it. But if you are going to engage in civil disobedience, it needs to be planned and thought through. Civil disobedience means you're going to disobey the law, and you could get arrested. You could get a ticket, or worse. That is the consequence. Dr. King wrote some of his most famous things from the jail in Birmingham, because that was the plan. It was a plan for Rosa Parks, right? I'm not giving up this seat, and I'm going to get arrested because I broke the law. That's civil disobedience, and you have to be prepared for the consequences and organized for the consequences. I remember the great apartheid protests outside the South African embassy in Washington, where they organized, and every day a different group of people would show up, sit down, they'd get arrested, go off to jail, and next day another group would show up. They were organized. They were prepared. It was peaceful, nonviolence, and it had its impact, as did what Dr. King did and what Mahatma Gandhi did in India. Resorting to violence, and I'll stop lecturing because I'm not a preacher. Resorting to violence is counterproductive. But if you engage in civil disobedience, plan it out. Be prepared for the consequences. Make sure everybody's aware of what could happen, and they go into it with their eyes open. I think that pretty much covers it in a summary. Again, a great document, a great checklist for you to use on a continuing basis at least once a year to make sure that you're keeping your organization on the straight and narrow. And then you can have the comfort of going off and doing your wonderful missions, your wonderful work out there, knowing that if the government or some entity comes knocking, you're prepared to deal with that. With that, I'd be glad to take questions. Yes, ma'am. Hi. Yeah. That's true. I'm sorry. I a little overstated that. That's right. You have to have them. Yeah. Yes. The reference is to Boulder Advocacy, which is a wonderful national organization that prepares materials for nonprofits. I use their materials all the time. I mean, rather than reinvent things myself, you can get their materials online. They have manuals, they have forums. It's a great resource for nonprofits. So great, thank you for that. Boulder Advocacy is the name of the outfit. Yeah.
Our organization is a small feminist, pro-feminist organization. It is in Canada, Spain, France, and Colombia, and in Venezuela. But we're a religious organization. And since we're strong feminists, we figure IRS is coming after us. So because we're in these different countries, we're all volunteers. We have no paid staff. So can you see anything, I guess, what would our future look like? You know, because we're international,
Right.
but we're all volunteer. It's the Association of Roman Catholic Women Priests for you folks. So, you know, do you see us, because I sit on the board, our little financial board, and I just really thank you so much for doing this, because I'm taking this back so that we can use it as a guideline. So what do you see as our greatest challenge under Donald Trump and his IRS?
Well, I think the foreign connections, probably the biggest one. I'm guessing that you are under the umbrella of the Catholic Church, right? No, you're not. You're separate from that. So are you a separate C3? Right. So I think following these guidelines and making sure that, you know, your corporate papers are in order and you're following all the right procedures, that's the best protection you can have in case the IRS or the ICE or somebody comes knocking.
So if we follow these,
Yep, and the Boulder Advocacy materials that were mentioned.
we don't do any advocacy except religious advocacy and social justice in that free time.
Right, well, that's great. I mean, don't be misled. Boulder Advocacy is just the title of the group. The materials apply to any 501c3 or C4. They're terrific stuff. But this was a good, small handout I could bring today, so that's why I did this one.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. The question is about, if I may, the question is about how long you have to keep certain records. And that, the number of years varies depending on the document, right? I mean, your corporate articles, your minutes, you would never get rid of those. Those are a permanent record. A lot of your financial records or your tax records, permanent. Other documents can be destroyed almost immediately, right? Some informal email that you're talking about, oh, we're going to have a meeting, or we're scheduling a meeting, that can be. And so, again, and you can scale this to the organization. You should have a policy for each category that tells the leader of the organization how long they have to keep certain documents. And then once a year, you can go through your documents saying, oh, this one was supposed to keep for 6 years, it's now been 7, so we can get rid of it, right? This document we're supposed to keep forever, got to keep it. So you need to have a policy because the number of years will vary depending on the document. Yeah. These are good questions. Other questions? I hope I haven't scared everybody into silence. Sure. Right. That's a checklist I use all the time. And then sometimes I get into arguments with my clients. So, oh, Mark, we want to treat them as an independent contractor. I said, I'm sorry, you can't because they are truly employees. So try to keep people on the right side of the law. Yes, of course. Well, I hate to sound so obvious, but don't do it again, ma'am. I'm just like, yeah. At the most, I would use the last 4 digits, and that's not unusual now on voter registration forms, for example. They sometimes ask you for the last 4 digits if you don't have a driver's license and so forth, but never, ever, ever give out the full Social Security number. But if you follow the steps that the credit bureau and your creditors have followed, that's the best you can do. Yeah. Not a personal credit attorney, so that's the limit of my knowledge. Yes, sir. Correct, or in your official capacity as pastor, right? And that's really hard for a pastor, right? Because your life is, you're the pastor of the church. I had the same problem. I was chair of the Democratic Party for nearly 20 years, and it was hard for me to act as a private citizen, right? Because, what do you mean? You're not a private citizen. You're the head of the party. So, yeah, but you have to be absolutely clear that you are doing it in your personal capacity, lest somebody out there who wants to create trouble for you or the church says, oh, pastor was breaking the law. He was endorsing that candidate. No, he wasn't. He was acting in his personal capacity. So a lot of time what you'll see is if your name's on a piece of lit, there'll be a little line underneath it that says in a personal capacity, right? Not as pastor of the church. So, people are doing things like that to protect themselves as much as possible. If you're doing candidate advocacy, I think that's what Pastor was specifically talking about. That crosses the line that I mentioned earlier, that a C3 cannot do any candidate work. But if you want to speak out on social issues, religious issues, that's all fine. No need for a disclaimer. That's your mission. But on candidate work, it has to be you as an individual. Great questions. Yes, sir. Yes, I mean, this is a very difficult area. I think the law is frequently broken across the political and religious spectrum. But I think, there's a lot of things people should do to safeguard themselves. If you're holding a forum or you're having an opportunity like that, make sure that you've invited all the candidates and can document. You're not required to make them show up or to cancel the event because somebody doesn't show up, but be able to prove that you invited everybody, that you were attempting to be neutral. And then, of course, whoever shows up at this candidate forum, treat them neutrally. Everybody gets the same opportunity, they get the same questions, so there's no evidence at all of any favoritism. But it's tricky. Well, and could be dangerous. There are folks who argue that those kind of restrictions on churches violate freedom of religion and the First Amendment. We don't have a resolution of that argument. I mean, part of this was, it's basically a trade-off. You get tax-exempt status and contributions to a tax deductible, and the trade-off is no candidate politics. That was the deal back in the 50s, I think, when this was added to the tax code. But we're still having, and you see this all the time in our country. We have a lot of church-state back and forth, push and pull over these kind of issues. Yes, sir. Yeah, again, I think as long as it's done on a neutral basis and you let somebody else, I mean, I did this all the time when I was party chair. I'd go to churches. I loved going to churches. All year round I would go to churches. It was wonderful. But you got to be open to anybody who wants to come in that capacity. Yeah, and be able to document that you've got, that you've done that, right? That you are open to everybody, because you don't want somebody saying, oh, he let the Democrat in, but I'm the Republican. He told me no. Donald? Yes, that's. Right. No, I do a lot of work for the League of Women Voters, and I'm a partisan. I'm proud of it. It's been my life, not ashamed of it. But they make sure, and they do this not just for me, but when I'm doing a program for them, they said, now, Mark's a partisan, but this is a nonpartisan event, and Mark understands that, and he's not going to be partisan here. So that kind of introductory remark is a standard part of what they do and what any organization like that should do. I think I saw another hand or two. Did I not? Maybe not. Again, great questions, good discussion. Or maybe I can give you some time back. Maybe people are a little tired after lunch, huh? Time for a nap. Okay, well, there's nothing else. Thank you for having me. It was great to see all of you. Thank you for what you do. Bless you all. I'm sorry? Oh, you're welcome. You're very welcome.